Okay, welcome everybody. We are live on A Mighty Blaze. This is Mark Cecil coming to you as the Thoughtful Bro. As always, I'm a writer, I'm an editor, I'm a journalist. I'm here to talk to you about what makes great books great, in a nutshell. And served up to you always as, the right amount of thoughtful, the right amount of bro. We're right there in the middle. A few items before we get started with our terrific guest today. We're here every Tuesday at 2. If you have a question for the authors of the book today, please leave it in the comment section and I will try to get to it at the end of the interview. Probably going to go about 45 minutes today, so you got plenty of time. As for the upcoming schedule, next week I'm going to have an amazing interview with Ya Jessie. Ya is the author of the celebrated novel Homegoing, which was her debut a few years ago, got tons and tons of press, and basically anywhere you look this week, next week, you're going to see Ya Jessie's name everywhere. This book has got so much buzz around it, and I think it's pubbing today, but she will be on with us next Tuesday, a week from now. So, on to this week on A Thoughtful Bro. I am so thrilled to welcome Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman. They're the authors of the absolutely can't miss and very, very necessary book on the current threats to American democracy and how our nation has navigated the same such threats in the past. The book is called Four Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, and it could not be more pertinent nor more timely. Suzanne and Robert, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Suzanne, let's see that book. Let's see that book.
Yes.
We're going to keep doing this. It's a beautiful cover. I love it. Very ominous, very ominous. Okay, so each of our guests today is just an extraordinarily distinguished list of accomplishments to their name, but I'm going to keep it super brief so we can get into this discussion. But very briefly, Robert Lieberman is the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He's an award-winning author on the topics of American political development, race within American politics, and public policy. He's also written extensively about comparative politics and the development of American democracy. Meanwhile, Suzanne, co-author of the book, is the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions in the Government Department at Cornell. She is the winner of many, many awards, just like Rob. And she's written on inequality, public policy, political behavior, democracy, and also American political development. So, Suzanne and Rob, welcome. The book is amazing. And can you just tell us two things? Tell us basically what it's about, and then also kind of how did you come to write this book at this particular time?
Yeah. Well, the book is about the question of, is American democracy in danger of real deterioration now? And how would we know if it is? And both Rob and I are instructors of the big course Intro to American Politics. And we used to teach this when we were both just out of grad school back in the 90s. And then we were away from it for many years, came back to it in recent years. And both of us felt like we were teaching about a different country. Politics has always been contentious and policymaking is complicated, but in recent years, things had changed such that polarization was really growing, making it hard for Congress to pass major laws, even when there's like widespread support for them among the American public. And Americans are growing increasingly disenchanted with government and angry at each other through polarization. So all of this is happening, and then the 2016 election comes along, and suddenly, it had been becoming harder and harder to teach this course, and suddenly every lecture we had to rethink it, because things that we thought we could take for granted, like the legitimacy of American elections or the freedom of the press, suddenly seemed to be up for grabs. So, it's at that point that I found myself talking to colleagues of mine who study other countries in the world and study what are the things that make democracy deteriorate. And they were saying things about the United States like, well, democracies don't last forever, they come and they go. And I thought, oh my goodness, I really think we need to look deeply at American history, which is something Rob and I are both very interested in, to see, has it been in danger before? And if so, what could we learn from that? So that's what the book is about.
Great. You and I were talking earlier before we went live, and you were just saying like you were wishing for a little more apathy these days. Is that how it is?
Yeah, no, we used to think that the biggest problem in American politics was apathy, that people didn't pay attention, that they didn't care. Now things are different.
Things are different. Yeah. Okay, so list out for me, just so everybody knows, the basic premise of the book is there's 4 kind of recurring threats that endanger our democracy, and they've come at different times in our history, but never quite all at once the way they are in this particular moment. And in the book, you walk through the 5 different major historical periods where we have faced at least a couple of these threats at once. So could you guys just list it out for our audience briefly, kind of in bullet point form? What are the 4 threats to American democracy, and what are the 5 periods where we faced them before?
Sure. So the 4 threats, and these are things, as Suzanne mentioned, we've learned a ton from friends and colleagues who study the rise and fall of democracy elsewhere in the world. So the 4 threats are things that we know from the stories of democracy elsewhere are threats to democracy. So the first is political polarization, the real division of a society into the sort of us versus them dynamic that threatens to overwhelm even ordinary disagreement. The second is what we call conflict over the boundaries of membership in the society, who's in and who's out, who's a full member of society and entitled to full rights and status, and who isn't. That in the United States usually expresses itself as racism or nativism, conflict over race and immigration. The third threat is high and rising income inequality, which can be dangerous for democracy. And the fourth is excessive executive power, when power in the government is concentrated too heavily in the executive, in the president, in a single person, rather than in, say, Congress or a parliament that tends to represent interests more broadly and be a forum for compromise. So those are the 4 threats. And then what we did was we looked at, as Suzanne said, 5 periods in American history before now when it seemed as though people genuinely feared that American democracy was going backwards. I mean, it's always been true from the very beginning that American democracy has been limited and compromised. People were excluded. African Americans were excluded for much of American history. Women were excluded from citizenship until relatively recently. But it's always been a sort of an attempt to move democracy in the right direction, to move forward. So these are times when people genuinely and reasonably feared that we were at risk of moving backward. So the 5 periods are the 1790s, the period right after the revolution and right after the Constitution is ratified, when the government almost falls apart in factionalism between Jefferson and Hamilton, if you've seen the show. The 1850s and the run-up to the Civil War, which obviously eventuates in the Civil War, which is a pretty big failure of democracy. The 1890s, which is a period of multiple conflicts at once, partisan polarization and economic conflict and racial conflict, that ultimately results in the disenfranchisement of several million African-American men who had gained voting rights and some measure of political empowerment in the South. The fourth is the 1930s. The Depression is a period of real fear that democracy, not just in the United States, but elsewhere in the Western world, is at risk. And then the fifth is the 1970s and the Watergate era. And Watergate is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg of a whole lot of scandals brewing in the Nixon administration, in which Nixon essentially tried to weaponize the federal government for his own political purposes.
And Rob, I know this, I'm putting you on the spot here, but could you say which one of these periods is the most like our own, if there is one you could choose?
Well, 3 of them, the 1790s and then 2 in the 20th century, were periods when one threat was prevalent. So it was polarization in the 1790s, and then executive aggrandizement or executive power in the 20th century, when the other 3 threats were relatively low. The 1850s and the 1890s saw 3 of the 4 threats in place at the same time. And this is one of the things we discovered, is these threats have sort of come and gone and combined and recombined in different ways over American history. So in the 1850s, you had polarization and conflict over race. That was the subject of the polarization in many cases, and high and rising income inequality. But now for the first time, I think you alluded to this in your intro, now for the first time, we've got all 4 threats at once, which is what we fear makes this a particularly challenging moment.
All right, we're going to get into all that in due time, but I want to first kind of introduce a metaphor that maybe just kind of help people digest what we're talking about here, and that is a metaphor of a patient and a doctor and an illness and a treatment. And so the patient is the body politic. The patient is American democracy. These four threats are, you could think of them as four symptoms of an illness, and that endanger the life of the body politic. Okay, and then you two are doctors who have come in and said, "Oh, I have diagnosed what your symptoms are," and so then the question, really, kind of what I want to get into kind of later in the interview, is like, what is the prognosis, and kind of what can we learn from when we came out of these illnesses in the past? What can we learn about our own resiliency, and what maybe treatments could work in the time we live in? So first, just want to ask you guys, do you feel like that's a kind of fair way to state the case?
I think that is a good metaphor. I mean, I like metaphors a lot, and there's never, perfect metaphor, but that's a pretty good one. I think that, what we discovered in writing this book is that American democracy has been fragile again and again. And, it's those combination of threats that make it vulnerable. So you can think of them as symptoms, or you can think of them of, the body being really vulnerable to getting horribly sick. And in either case, what was so striking to us is that, whereas I think Americans who came of age like us in the latter part of the 20th century have thought of American democracy as being very secure, and as being in many ways a model for the world. We've had the oldest constitution, we have checks and balances. While the country was very undemocratic in some ways early on, we think of it as having this trajectory of becoming progressively more democratic over time. And so we're not used to thinking of American democracy as fragile. And yet, once you start studying history, you find it's happened again and again.
I agree. I feel like I am a perfect layperson example of somebody who just kind of thinks that, like, well, I think you described it in another interview I heard as like an on-off switch rather than a continuum. Like you can have like grades of democracy, whereas like I just sort of obviously naively have always thought, well, you just have democracy or you don't have it, and that's just what it is. And we have it, and we're always going to have it, and that's that. But so I know how I sound to you right now. But I just want to say, like, we will get into some more optimistic parts at the end, I hope, of this interview. But I guess like my take on that metaphor that I gave is like, well, this we've been through these 5 near critical periods of illness, and look, we've come out of them all, and like, that which does not kill American democracy shall make it stronger. I mean, am I hopelessly Pollyanna-ish to think that because we have overcome this 5 times before in sort of one form or another, that speaks more to resiliency than fragility?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that were true, or I wish I had your confidence that were true. Let me put it that way. I mean, I think another way to spin the metaphor is that, repeated bouts can weaken our defenses. And I think the way to think about this historically is that the resolutions to these crises have not always been these sort of heroic democracy-saving moments. Too often, what happens is we preserve a form of democracy for some of us, particularly for white Americans, at the expense of continuing or even, sort of expanding the exclusion of others, African Americans especially. That was what happened in the 1890s, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that. So, it's not always we don't always make a full recovery. Yeah. Right? There's a little piece of the story that gets left. There's a piece of not a little piece, a big piece of the country that often gets left behind. So it's not it's not always a progressive kind of happy, we're always moving forward kind of tale.
Sometimes it's, sorry, we have to amputate your leg.
Like yeah, no, exactly.
Okay. All right, so we're going to return to some of the kind of the settlements that have been made, and kind of like these ways we've recovered via some kind of not idealistic kind of deal on race. We're going to return to that a little bit later. I think that's really interesting. But so just again, to go back into this on-off switch for democracy, I mean, I heard you guys say, and again, I just feel like I often feel hopelessly optimistic when I hear you guys say this, but I know you're right that this is a continuum that we're on. And I've heard you say that the U.S., according to some such study or another, is not ranked among the world's best functioning democracies. It's sort of you guys can use the term, whatever term it is, a quasi-functioning democracy. But, I mean, you're certainly not taught that in this country. You're sort of taught that this is the beacon on the hill and we are the standard bearer for democracy, but that is not the case at all. So I'm curious kind of like, first, what is that about? Like, why are we not at the top of the list? And I'm also very curious, who is at the top of the list? Like, who has the best functioning democracy in the world?
The short answer to that is Norway. Norway does very well, and so do many Western European countries. This comes not from our work, but rather there are these watchdog organizations, Freedom House and then The Economist, that they do these rankings year after year, and they look at all sorts of indicators for all countries in the world, and they decide, where they are in the democracy index. And yeah, the United States had long been in the very top group, and it's been slipping for some time over the past 10, 15 years into the next group, which doesn't mean authoritarianism, but they use terms like a flawed democracy. And the way Rob and I think about this in the book, we have 4 things that we identify as pillars of democracy. And those are, first of all, free and fair elections. That's what makes, that's fundamental to individuals choosing representatives, etc. The rule of law, no one is above the law and no one governs by sheer personal power, but by the rule of law. The legitimacy of the opposition, that even if your party loses elections, you need to be able to be free to compete and to try to win another day. And then finally, the integrity of rights, meaning civil liberties, civil rights, political rights. And when we look at all of those things, if you look back at past years, you can find some instance where, there's a little bit of deterioration to one of those things or another, and then usually rebounding within the next few years. During the last handful of years, we've seen real deterioration on those pillars of democracy, and perhaps particularly free and fair elections and the rule of law. I mean, I could, just list multiple things that have happened in the last few years that have dealt real damage to each of them.
Suzanne, Rob, I don't know if you want to add something, but I mean, I just couldn't help but think it was almost uncanny to hear you read those 4 pillars of democracy and think to myself, I could probably flip over to the front page of any news outlet today and find a story on how all 4 of those are in danger right now. The overlap is almost exact.
Yeah, I think we have the same sensation, and we felt like that when we were writing the book. You open every day over the last couple of years as we've been working on the book, you turn on the TV or open the paper, and there's some new affront to one of these characteristics of democracy. I mean, it drove us crazy, frankly, because we'd have to figure out, do we need to say something about this? Do we need to incorporate this or that, detail or news story? And we ended up trying not to make the book. It's not a current events book, and we're not trying to be current in terms of, down to the minute, but to give you a lens to think about what you see in the news, because it is, as you say, from day to day, pretty frightening.
And the damage is accelerating as well, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the free and fair election thing, I mean, I don't want to get totally sidetracked by current events, but I mean, the free and fair election thing didn't seem to be, I mean, certainly you had foreign interference, but this idea, everything with the Postal Service, I mean, it's just like, it's less a kind of steady erosion than a kind of full frontal attack on these things right now. Right. But all right, so let's go back to this metaphor of the patient is on the table, you got 4 symptoms. Tell me, doctors, point me to another patient who died of these symptoms. I want you to look out in the world and say, like, there but for the grace of God go you. What is another country that at one point had a comparable or even more healthy democracy than ours and now has something which is not? And we could be them if we don't start paying attention.
Sadly, you could look around the world and see right now a number of such countries that were, functioning democracies until pretty recently and have sort of fallen out of that category. Russia, Hungary, Venezuela, Turkey. And what you learn from looking at those kinds of comparisons is that democracy doesn't die anymore by, it's not tanks in the streets, it's not a coup, it's not, the colonels announcing that we've taken over the airport and the television station, like in the movies, but it's slow hollowing out from the inside by an elected leader.
Yeah.
Who uses tools at usually his disposal to, tilt the playing field or to ensure that his power continues. And as Suzanne said a minute ago, one of the characteristics of democracy, of a functioning democracy, is that today's losers can become tomorrow's winners, right? And everyone understands that. So in these countries, what you see is elected leaders, trying to solidify their hold on power so that future elections can't harm them. And that's the dangerous path.
Yep. Totally understood. All right. So I have a few questions from the audience. Guys, just hang tight. We're going to get them about 20 minutes, like around 2:40. I'll try to wrap my part and get to your questions. All right, let's take a different metaphor. Let's just say that we're going to use the terror threat level alert system, and it's blue is everything is safe, and like in Norway probably, and green it's getting worse, yellow, orange, and obviously red is terror threat level, or the maximum terror threat level. I just want to ask you guys, what threat level would you put us at now in terms of the American democracy being at risk?
Well, I would say, again, it's a useful question to think about. I think from day to day, I veer from saying we're from yellow to orange. But what's troubling, as I was saying a few moments ago, this damage to the pillars of democracy has been accelerating. And I would not be surprised that we could wake up some months from now and feel that we're more in the red zone.
And following up on that, I'm kind of curious, what would trigger that for you? Give me a cross the Rubicon kind of moment. And I understand all the points you're making, which are very good, about the kind of subtle erosion through an elected leader over time. But just talk to me about some nightmare scenario for 2020, something that triggers to you, like we've actually gone past a point that it will be almost impossible to return from.
Well, what I would say is that, as Rob and I looked at rising polarization in the book, which is, really dangerous, particularly when it's in combination with these other threats, both parties deserve some of the blame or credit for leading to the kind of polarization we have today. But the damage to democracy that is ensuing from polarization, we found that the Republicans have been more willing to engage in that, to make winning at all costs the priority above upholding democracy. And that's what's been occurring with accelerating intensity. And so the concern is that, if in this election, Republicans come out of it having really won at all levels, continuing to maintain most state legislatures, gaining more governorships, keeping the presidency, keeping the Senate, that we will be in a situation where they can increasingly stack the deck, and they seem to be willing to do that, to stack the deck against the other party. And the problem is the failure to uphold the rules of the game of being in a democracy. In a democracy, we're supposed to have competition, and there are real differences of opinion about things, and we're supposed to be able to, through politics, compete on those terms and negotiate and work out deals. The problem is when one side or the other says, I'm not going to play by the rules anymore, and the rules are upholding these four pillars. And so we really could be moving in that direction. And it's possible that the election itself could exacerbate things.
Okay. Well, look, we are going to take a little bit of turn toward the positive here, kind of to talk about a little bit more about the resiliency of our democracy and how we might come back. And I just was hoping one of you, just in the briefest of terms, and I know you got to buy this book to really dig into these issues, and they're extremely interesting once you start pulling them apart. And me, Pollyanna that I am, I took hope from it, because I just thought, okay, well, it's imperfect. we're heading in the right direction, and we've done it before, we'll do it again. But anyway, could one of you just like walk me through one of these historical time periods where there was a critical threat to our democracy? How was it then resolved? What was the medicine that cured us?
Well, I think, you know, as I said, first of all, not all of the stories have happy, heroic endings. I think probably the closest to that is, ironically, the Watergate scandal, which was, you know, a set of interlocking scandals, really, in which the Nixon administration and the president himself essentially weaponized the presidency as a political tool. And tried to use the power of his office to intimidate opponents and rig elections and the like. Nixon was eventually brought down. And how did that happen? It was a combination of bipartisan cooperation in Congress. He was a Republican, but enough Republicans in Congress ultimately saw the weight of the evidence against him and were willing to remove him from office. But also other actors in the system sort of played constitutionally faithful roles. The Department of Justice investigated. Judges were willing to uphold the rule of law in the face of these challenges. The press, reporters were a really big part of the Watergate story, uncovering wrongdoing at a time when I think, you know, the investigative, what we might now think of as the mainstream press, had a little bit more widespread prestige and confidence among the public than maybe it does today. So there was a moment where, you know, the democracy, the country was really under threat from these activities in the executive branch. But a combination of factors and a bunch of people doing their jobs managed to piece it back together. Sadly, that's not so typical a story in the episodes that we looked at.
Yep. Well, yeah. Sometimes it's overwhelming how great the divide seems to be between the two parties, and it does seem like impossible to imagine now. Certainly after we went through an impeachment trial where there were no witnesses called and so few defectors, only one defector ultimately. But I want to like pull apart just one of these issues, one of these four threats, and it's kind of segues from your previous answer, which is hyperpartisanship. You know, ever since I kind of became a young man and started paying attention, I mean, the first time I started paying attention to politics was probably in the Clinton administration. And I remember kind of the vast right-wing conspiracy and so on and so forth. And the line at that time was, we've never been more divided, you know, and like, that might be just like journalist hyperbole. And you just kind of would have heard that all throughout the history of the United States if you just turned on your radio or equivalent. But I don't know, it just always seems to be getting more partisan. And I guess like what I want to ask you guys is has there been a time in the past where there was this intense hyperpartisanship, and what was the event that brought them together? Maybe Rob, you know, just the overwhelming weight of evidence against Nixon was one, so that's an example. But are there other examples of, I'm just trying to see a way out of this thicket of hyperpartisanship? What could bring our country together? Maybe something like a 9/11. 9/11, I think, had there was some national unity after that. But anyway, just what do you guys think about how this can be stitched up?
Well, I would say that, you know, partisanship does not go away quickly when it's very intense. You know, if you look at it, it's amazing in the nation's first decade during the 1790s, polarization grew really quickly, and it was really led by political leaders, even ones who had been part of the founding era and who at that point in time had been against political parties. They became the leaders, the creators of political parties. And going into the election of 1800, and a lot of people thought the nation might not make it through, that there was going to be civil war if one side or the other didn't like the outcome. The nation gets through that, and then, you know, gradually in the early 19th century develops more of an idea of legitimate opposition, and political parties in a more formal way emerge and begin to compete with each other. And that becomes kind of, you know, the rules of the game, that parties can compete and you win some and you lose some. But then we become very polarized again around the Civil War, and by the late 19th century. In the 20th century, we had a long period of less polarization. There were real kinds of divergence of views in the United States, but they weren't organized neatly between the parties, and we weren't sorted out that way as people. There were all sorts of what political scientists call cross-cutting cleavages, where you might be in the opposite party from someone, but you might go to the same church as them, or you might belong to the same Lions Club or something else. And so people had ways of affiliating, whereas now things have sorted out much more. And I think having a century that was characterized by all of these wars and so many people serving in wars created a kind of unity among the public and getting through the Great Depression, et cetera. But here comes another crisis, the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and one might have thought that would be the kind of event that would lessen polarization, and it hasn't at all. Now we're polarized about wearing masks and so on. So it's a long, slow process to emerge from polarization.
I've often had that exact same thought, Suzanne, that you just articulated, that just kind of a basic theory that you need some kind of great crisis to unify people, and kind of like, okay, there's something outside our body which threatens us, and in the absence of outside threats, maybe the body politic turns against itself a little bit more. But I've had that thought about coronavirus so many times, that this could have been a moment to, even compete with other countries, just see, like, can we get our level of infection rates down below Germany's, or can we lead the world? Can we show the world what a great place we are? It's like, it really is this global stage to kind of like come together and outstrip other nations as one. And it just seems like it's just continues to be a tool to rip us apart even further.
Yeah, I think that speaks to what Suzanne was mentioning a minute ago, which is that that polarization has really become a sort of, it's not just we disagree about issues. It's really become a sort of a kind of social identity. Partisanship is part of our social identity for many of us. There's a piece of data that we cite in the book that people might have heard before, that there was a survey question asked of Americans, I think in the 1960s, that asked, how would you feel? Would you be upset if your son or daughter married someone of the opposite party? It's kind of like, marrying outside the faith, but for politics, right? And in the 60s, some people said, yes, I would be upset, but most people said, no, it wouldn't bother me, I don't care. When that question was asked again a few years ago, a majority of people said, yes, I would be upset if my son or daughter brought home someone of the opposite party. And that speaks to how much of an identity partisanship has become. And that just makes it much harder to bridge these gaps. And then on top of that, we have our own social and professional circles. We live in our own neighborhoods. We have our own sources of news, and so on and so forth. So that just makes these gaps harder, so that when there is an event like the pandemic, it tends to drive the wedge in farther rather than bringing us together, which is the way we typically think about these sort of big, calamitous events. 9/11 you mentioned, World War II, these big dangerous events have for a long time tended, at least temporarily, to bring the country together for a time. Then we remember that we disagree and we go back to disagreeing. But that has not happened this time, and I think it's largely a reflection of this kind of division.
Yeah, I agree. So a few of the questions that I've gotten from the audience are sort of the same question, and it's leading into a question that I wanted to ask, which is that, it can feel very overwhelming. I mean, you can, to an individual, you can feel that, everybody all around, everybody's saying vote, 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 but that's fine. But I live in Massachusetts. My vote really doesn't matter. I mean, Massachusetts, I think, might even lead the nation in terms of tilting toward the Democratic Party, there's like no way that I'm going to see a Joe Biden campaign event in this state, or a Trump event for that matter. I think there were some fundraisers last time, but anyway, the point is, if you're in a non-battleground state, you can also feel that, like, you know, as you were saying, Rob, a second ago, that the news sources of news and information are completely you know, factionalized. Even if you do have a massive platform, you're only going to be preaching to the choir a lot of the time. Anyway, all of which is kind of in a long-winded way of saying that, like, as an average person, there doesn't seem to be a channel for your frustration, your despair, your anger, your passion, to put a nice word on it. Do you guys have any thoughts? I know this isn't really your, you know, you are historians and analysts of American political history, but is there something you can say practically to the audience about what should we do with all these feelings that are being stirred up?
Well, one thing I would say to the folks in Massachusetts, or to, you know, anywhere where they feel that their votes in the presidential election don't really matter that much. And I mean, that's true actually in a lot of states where people don't feel like they're swing states. That doesn't matter. We have to remember that politics happens at all levels. And I think people make the mistake of focusing too much on just the national level, and even just the presidency. And I think it's great to really get involved at the local level and the state level. You know, one of the things that actually, it can be a deterrent to democracy in some ways, but at this moment can also be helpful, is American federalism, and the fact that we have all of these separate governments all over the country. So we need all of these governments at every level to be thriving and to be democratic, small d democratic, and so people can get involved at whatever level where they feel they can make a difference to try to make that happen. But stepping back more broadly, you know, this sounds very simple, but what Rob and I think people need to do is to champion democracy. It's, you know, in these very polarized times, we become very divided over policy issues, or at least we think we are. Sometimes public opinion polls show that there's actually more agreement than meets the eye on many issues. But what's crucial for this process to continue, where we can, you know, work through our differences and try to create public policies to address things we care about, is we have to have democracy, and these rules of the game, these pillars of democracy we've been talking about, need to be intact. And right now they need a champion. They need many champions, because they're under attack. And so we think that, you know, when Americans are looking at any, you know, political platform or public policy issue, you know, you might look at it through, you know, does it cohere with my ideology and values? Does it serve my interests and all of that? And that's all part of politics. But we think that more fundamental than that is asking, what does it do for democracy? And is it going to help to strengthen these pillars, or will it make them deteriorate? And that needs to be a real priority.
Great. So I got one more question, then we'll get to some of these audience questions. But Suzanne, you've made some interesting remarks, and I know you've done a lot of work on race in American politics, as have you, Rob. But Suzanne, I've heard you kind of in other interviews articulate this point of view that, like, often the casualty or the kind of like bidding chip, or whatever, the chip on the table that gets used has to do with race. And it's sort of like, in order to kind of settle, is a word that I've heard you use, or kind of resolve these crises of democracy, often, like, the group that bears the brunt of it is minorities, and particularly African Americans. And I know, for example, like Reconstruction is just a terrific, obvious example of that. But, like, I've also heard you express hope that maybe this time, you know, the settling of our democracy does not have to be on the backs of racial minorities. Can you just encapsulate that idea?
Yeah, that's right. So, you know, Rob and I think we approached this book thinking, well, we're going to study these periods from the past, and then we'll learn constructive lessons of, you know, what the United States can do when democracy is in danger. And to the contrary, the real conclusion we came to that characterizes really 4 out of the 5 periods is that the solution was really tragic in many ways. It involved a settlement where there was either the restoration of racial hierarchy, or the agreement that people came to was built on top of racial hierarchy that remained undisturbed, despite all of the differences over other things. And so that's happened time and again in American history. And, you know, the most, a period that seems very much like our own, the 1890s, you had 3 of the 4 threats combined. And what ends up happening is that African Americans in the South, who'd been practicing their political rights for a few decades then and were, you know, voting at high rates and running for office, Southern Democrats decide, enough of this, we're going to shut them down because we don't want political opposition. And so, you know, they introduce poll taxes and literacy tests, and this happens all over the South. And African Americans then not only lost political rights, which were gone to them for 60 years until, you know, the achievements of the civil rights era, but then after that, they lost civil liberties and civil rights as well. So it's a, you know, a really tragic lesson about what can go wrong when democracy is in danger. And however, and I say this, you know, really guardedly, but with some hope, I think that today, unlike all of these other periods, there are more Americans than ever who actually embrace the ideal of equality and would like the United States to be, to have greater equality around race as well as around gender and in some other ways in addition. And that's become all the more clear this summer after the, in June when the Black Lives Matter protests took off. It was really striking how, you know, that the people who are marching, it's a really broad cross-section of Americans, much more so than in the civil rights era. And a lot of white Americans marching and joining in. And public opinion seems to be showing some kind of shift of greater support for racial equality in the United States. So the big question for us is, can we in the United States do something now that we have not managed successfully to do before? And that is to come out of this crisis and this big crisis with all 4 threats raging, but this time to actually make democracy stronger for everyone.
A beautiful sentiment, one I wholly support. So I'm going to get into a few quick questions from the audience. One, Joe asks, are the authors familiar with Ezra Klein's work on political partisanship, especially as it relates to partisan media? And did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Ezra Klein's work on polarization is fantastic, and he's really done an amazing service to bring a lot of very sophisticated scholarship to a broad reading public, and I salute him for that. Yeah, the media and the divisions of the media are really important to the way polarization plays out. You know, we've alluded to this already. There's, you know, sort of separate news sources that these different partisan communities tap into. So you can watch, you know, on any given night, Fox News or MSNBC and get an entirely different take or approach on the day's news. This has happened before. Even this has happened before in the 1790s, which was the first era of intense polarization in the American experiment. There were similar newspaper wars. Each of the factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, had their own newspaper. You know, that were deliberately set up to promote their own leaders' views and to, you know, bring the good word to their partisans, to their voters, to their public. And, you know, some of the things that went back and forth in these newspaper wars of the 1790s make the cable news wars of today look kind of like a polite garden party. I mean, this was, you know, very direct, personal, nasty, conflictual writing. Mm-hmm. So this is even that is a recurring pattern. You know, the idea that you want to present the truth to, as you see it, to your readership and to your public as a way of, you know, sort of intensifying partisan divisions and riling up your supporters, you know, against the other team, right? This is a team sport.
Right.
And you want your team to win, and you'll use any opportunity to promote your team.
Great. All right. Another, just two more quick questions from the audience, and then I'll move into my final question. Just really quickly on this. I mean, somebody's asking, it's sort of like a long question, but the heart of the question is, how did we get to this point sort of like without us noticing, or with like, were we sort of sleepwalking, and like, it's a continuing to happen, and it just feels like it's this like slow landslide, and then one day you're going to wake up and it's just gone. And so the heart of the question is sort of like, if we're worried, but like it's still happening, and how did we get here without sort of noticing?
Yeah, it's a little bit like the frog in boiling water, right? That it happens slowly over time and you don't notice it. We track these 4 threats, and they've each had their own pattern over time and when they wax and wane. The growth of presidential power in the United States has really been happening from the 1930s to the present, and it's really interesting because presidents of both parties have left the office more empowered for the next occupant. Then economic inequality has been, after being relatively low in the mid-20th century, has been on the rise since the 1970s, and affluent people in the past couple of decades especially have become much more politically active. And then if you look at political polarization, that again had been lower in the mid-20th century. It's really been from the late 1970s to the present that has been on the rise, with public officials encouraging it, and then it really taking off among the public. And then conflict over race. This has waxed and waned throughout American history, and it seemed to be diminishing somewhat in the late 20th century. But I would say that it has reemerged with polarization, and debate over it has become really polarized, and the parties themselves have become very different in terms of their racial composition. And so that's something that was kind of like brewing underground, ready to be tapped, but has taken off again in the last decade or so.
Great, thank you. All right, one last question from the audience. This again, sort of a lengthy question, but it taps into this doctor-patient metaphor. Just the idea being that, will we develop antibodies for this? In other words, so let's say it's, the next administration comes in, whenever that is. I mean, certainly, not everything that's going on right now is caused by the current administration. These are like, as you have stated many times in this interview, these are like long-standing trends that have sort of all come to a head suddenly, but it's not like it all just happened recently. But I guess just sort of like, what are, just really quickly, because we are running out of time, what are sort of like some of the policy antidotes, the antibodies that could be developed? I mean, when you see kind of a, ignoring of things like the Hatch Act or the Emoluments Clause, things like this, which seem to be kind of like standing political, accepted, unspoken rules of political behavior, which are being steamrolled, are there antibodies that can be put into place, and what are the most critical ones?
Yeah, I guess everyone's searching for vaccines these days.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and these are very hard genies to put back in the bottle, to pile another metaphor on. On the ones we've already used. But you could imagine, these might be small things, but you could imagine, for example, a scenario where, say, Biden wins the presidency and the Democrats reclaim the Senate. One of the things that I think people have found very frustrating, democracy watchers in the United States have found very frustrating, is Congress's inability to stand up to this creep of presidential power. Biden is a creature of the Congress. He spent most of his adult life as a United States senator. So you could imagine a scenario where Congress tries to reassert some oversight over the executive branch and tries to right that ship a little bit. And you can imagine a President Biden being willing to go along with some of that. I mean, often
sort of relinquishing some of the powers.
I mean, that's hard to do, though. I mean, often typically you'd see a president who, when he was a senator, said, "Oh my goodness, the president has too much power." But then when he becomes president, says, "Hey, I have power. I'd like more." So that's not an easy thing for self-interested, motivated politicians to do. But I think there's common agreement that that's, as an example, sort of rebalancing power between Congress and the president would help to restrain, maybe help to restrain some of these impulses in the past. Now, Congress tried to do that after the excesses of the Nixon administration, and it worked kind of for a little while. But in the bigger picture, it didn't really stem the flow of power to the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. So even that might be a little bit of a reach. I think some movement toward racial justice, as Suzanne was alluding to a minute ago, some reckoning with the legacy of systemic racism that sort of undergirds almost all of American politics. If something in that direction comes out of the protest movements of this summer, that might push in the right direction. Again, I would be very guarded about that, though, because even though there seems to be more support for racial equality now than we've seen for a while, there's a lot of conflict and a lot of politics between here and there.
Great. All right. Very last question. This is my final question. Just super quick answer. As both of you look out right now on the political landscape, what gives you hope?
Well, what I do know is that despite the incredible polarization that we're seeing right now, and elections really heighten that, so it just feels like Americans are at war with each other. We do know that Americans, when they're asked all these questions on surveys about their belief in democratic principles, it's one thing where Democrats and Republicans are almost in concert. They feel the same way. They strongly agree that these principles are important, and vast majorities of both do. So that's hopeful. The thing is, we need political leaders to champion those values across the board and to really be, speak in concert about them. And so that's my hope, is that the kind of, I think wellspring of belief in democracy that does undergird the United States can be mobilized, and that we can strengthen it.
Great. Rob?
John Lewis, in that beautiful essay that the New York Times published on the day of his funeral, said, I'm paraphrasing here, he said, democracy is not something we are, it's something we do. And I think that as well as anything captures our view of what democracy, how we think about democracy. To me, there were the images from this summer that gave me hope were of the elections. They were the primary elections held after the pandemic in places like Georgia and Wisconsin. There were a couple of others that were, they were infuriating because they were messy and complicated, and people had to stand on line in these socially distanced lines, down the sidewalk and around the block for hours to vote. But the fact that just the picture of Americans standing in line for the privilege of voting, I found heartening. I think there's a level of engagement and attention that's been drawn to these issues now. Americans are taking this seriously. And I think the more we can do that and the more we can encourage that, the more hope I'll have.
Awesome. All right, terrific note to end on. Suzanne, could you hold up the book, 4 Threats, one more time for everybody to see? 4 Threats. There'll be lots of links in the comment section below about how to buy this book if you want to buy it. It's a terrific book. I read it in a couple of sittings. I want to thank you, Rob and Suzanne, for coming on. I appreciate you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right. So next week at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, we'll be back with Ya Jessie and her new book, Transcendent Kingdom. And I will see you all then. Thanks so much. And we're off.
Okay.
All right.
And that was fantastic.
Yeah,
that was great.
Really
yeah. Thanks so much for having us.
So much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Oh God, Rob, I was saying to Suzanne before you got on that I just love Morning Joe so much. I mean, I just I could go on and on, but suffice it to say, it's this is maybe my first time I covered basically entrepreneurship and finance for Reuters for years. Now I mostly talk about fiction, but this is totally scratching that itch for me. I love talking about this stuff, and you guys were amazing.
Well, that's great. That's great. Well, one of the things we found in writing the book is there are so many stories. I mean, you could almost write this book like a screenplay.
Yeah, it's true. Really dramatic stories.
Yeah,
it's so dramatic. I mean, I think Trump has a lot of strange gifts, but certainly one of them is he has a way of framing everything in the most dramatic possible fashion. I mean, sometimes we don't have to get into this, but just one thought is like, sometimes I think he throws out these things like him like not accepting the results of the election in a way, like just to boost ratings effectively, like just,
right.
you know?
Yeah. No, I think people, I think, you know, people make the mistake of like attributing these deep strategic motives to him, when I think it's mostly just attention seeking.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
And
he's a reality TV producer.
It's totally
like that's
reality TV.
fundamentally what he's doing.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Yep. All right, guys. Well, look,
anyway,
this was
thank
amazing.
you so much.
Congratulations, guys. I hope we
Thank
sell
you.
some books out of this for you guys. But the book is terrific.
Thanks.
so
And we
much.
should
Really
get you a copy of the book. If you don't have an actual hard copy, we'll make sure that St. Martin sends you one.
Oh, that's so nice of you. Okay, cool. That's great.
Okay, great.
All right, guys, I'll send you a link to this. A recording of this will appear pretty quick.
Great.
And just by the way, like the viewers that we get tends to go up a whole lot over the next few days, and usually like peaks by about Saturday. So
Okay.
We get some traction on the live, but then people just keep tuning in.
Tune in afterward. Great.
Fantastic.
So I'll send you the link. Okay.
Terrific.
All right. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Take
All right,
care,
thanks, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.